Hello, everybody. Greetings and welcome to the inaugural episode of Two Priests in Palestine, a podcast of interviews and storytelling that sheds light on the current reality of Palestine. My name is Jerlyn Henry, and with me as co-host is Jeff Nowers. We are both priests in the Anglican Diocese of Toronto in Canada. In December of 2025, Jeff and I were part of a 9-person delegation that made a solidarity pilgrimage to the West Bank. We went there to meet with Palestinians, to listen, to learn, and to bear witness so that after returning back to Canada, we might be more effective ambassadors of Palestinian liberation. Some of the most common things that people say when discussing Palestine is, it's complicated, or I just don't know enough about the history. Well, today, we are going to tackle the history. With us to do that is Dr. Zachary Foster, the historian and editor-in-chief of Palestine Nexus, a research and education platform that offers courses on Palestinian history, on Jewish anti-Zionism, and many other topics. Zach earned a Ph.D. at Princeton University with a dissertation titled The Invention of Palestine. He's an excellent historian, an engaged scholar who is both Jewish and anti-Zionist. We're grateful that you have set some time aside to be with us today. Welcome to Two Priests in Palestine.
Thank you for having me.
So let's begin with a more personal question. You identify as Jewish. Could you describe how you were raised in relation to Judaism? How did you become an advocate to Palestine from that faith?
Judaism has always been central to my identity. I grew up going to Jewish schools and Jewish summer camps and Jewish youth groups. I traveled to Israel with my Jewish youth group when I was in high school. I spent a semester in Jerusalem as an undergraduate student because I wanted to live in my quote-unquote homeland. And by the way, I said I went to Jewish schools, Jewish summer camps, Jewish youth groups. I could have also said I went to Zionist schools, Zionist youth groups, Zionist summer camps, because Judaism and Zionism were presented to me as the same thing. You would celebrate Israel's Independence Day at the day school that I went to, Hillel Day School in Detroit, Michigan, for the same reason we would celebrate Passover and Hanukkah and Shavuot. They were all part of Judaism, at least that's how they were presented to us. So I got interested in Israel. And the more you get interested in Israel, the more you're going to get interested in Palestine. And that was the case with me. I spent a semester in Jerusalem as an undergraduate student. And like I said, I went there because I wanted to live in my homeland. And I found myself on Har Tzofim in what is basically East Jerusalem in an Arab neighborhood. And I found myself in a Hebrew language class with half Palestinian Arabs. The only thing I knew about Palestinians, or at least the only thing I thought I knew, was that they wanted to kill me. That turned out to be false. Actually, the Palestinians were the nicest people in the class. They wanted to meet outside of class to practice Hebrew with me. They wanted to show me around their neighborhoods. They wanted to introduce me to Arab culture. And so everything I thought I knew about this group of people turned out to be a complete myth. And so I got more interested and dug deeper. And to summarize a lot of history, what I would say is the deeper you dig into the history of Zionism, the more anti-Zionist you become. And that was the case with me, because you discover that every Zionist leader, beginning in the 1880s, going on down to 1948, and of course beyond 48, supported the transfer of Palestinians out of Palestine. That was how you were going to create a Jewish state in a country that was 95% non-Jewish. Right? So when the Zionists started to migrate to Palestine in the 1880s, they set up Jewish colonies with the goal of creating a Jewish majority in a country that was overwhelmingly non-Jewish. In order to then establish that Jewish state in a country that remained overwhelmingly non-Jewish in 1948, they had to kick out the Palestinians. And for decades and decades, they were discussing, how are we going to do this? Like, they all agreed on what the solution was. They called it transfer. Today we call it forcible displacement or ethnic cleansing. And so when you read that history and you learn that this ideology, this movement was hell-bent on displacing 1.5 million Palestinians.
You've used the term Zionism a few times there, and for not to assume that everybody understands what that term means, because it's for many people that's a controversial term. Can you offer a definition of what Zionism is?
Great question, because if you ask a Zionist what Zionism means, they'll tell you Zionism is the belief that Jews have a right to be safe in their ancestral homeland. I mean, the first problem with that definition of Zionism is it imagines Zionism as an abstract idea. But Zionism was not an abstract idea. It was a historical movement with leaders and followers and rivalries and institutions and policies and political parties and militias that established a Jewish state in a country of overwhelming non-Jews in 1948. The movement painted itself as a movement rescuing Jews from persecution, saving Jews fleeing the pogroms. That was also a myth. In fact, most of the Jews that were fleeing pogroms from the 1880s and all the way until 1940 were rejected by the Zionist movement. In 1918 and 1921, about 50 to 100,000 Ukrainian Jews were slaughtered. It was the worst pogrom of all the pogroms. By far, it was like two orders of magnitude more violent and more deadly than any previous pogrom to date. And, fortunately, it was just at that time that the British government embraced the Balfour Declaration. I mean, alas, these hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian Jews who were literally fleeing persecution, they were literally running for their lives. They were being slaughtered in the tens of thousands. Many of them wanted to come to Palestine. I mean, alas, Zionism is a safe haven for Jews, right? I mean, that's what we're all told. The Zionist movement was about state building. It was, we want to build a Jewish state in a non-Jewish country. It was not about rescuing Jews. And in fact, oftentimes rescue got in the way of state building. So for example, in the 1940s, in 1945, 46, 47, you had hundreds of thousands of Jewish DPs, Jewish displaced persons, Holocaust survivors, in DP camps in Austria, Germany, and Italy. And there were all these attempts by British and French and American Jews to rescue those displaced Jews, those Holocaust survivors, bring them to Britain, bring them to France, bring them to the United States. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Zionist community in Palestine, he travels to Austria and Germany, meets with all the DP leaders, and says, you are not going to allow any Jew to be rescued to Britain, France, or the United States. Because his belief was that if you allow rescue to dominate the agenda of Jewish philanthropy, then Zionism and the Zionist movement and the Zionist plan and project will fall to the back burner. So Zionism, just to return to your question, was a movement that set out to establish in a Jewish state in a non-Jewish country. That is the definition of Zionism. We're going to establish a Jewish state in a non-Jewish country. That is Palestine.
Let me take you or take us back, I guess, to the 19th century. What did Jewish, Christian, Muslim relations look like on the ground in Palestine prior to the emergence of political Zionism?
So on the eve of Zionist immigration, so we're talking 1870s, Palestine was about 85% Muslim, 10% Christian, and 5% Jewish. And I think it's fair to say that those three religious communities were experiencing a kind of a golden age in Palestine on the eve of Zionist immigration. Let me explain. So you have these anecdotes from Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike, from all three communities, of, for example, the memoir of Wasif Jawhariyeh. He was a Christian Orthodox musician, lived in Jerusalem in the late Ottoman period. So kind of on the, as the Zionist movement was gaining steam in the 1890s and first decade and a half of the 20th century, but still before the Zionist movement has really transformed the relations between the communities. And he talks about, as a Christian musician, going and playing music at Jewish weddings. He talks about twice a year in the Palestinian neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, which is today in East Jerusalem. He talks about how the Jews of Jerusalem, the Sephardi Jewish community, would go on picnics in Sheikh Jarrah to the tomb, to the grave of Rav Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Just. And he's a Jewish mystic, very famous Jewish mystic. And they would picnic there twice a year. And the Muslims and Christians of Jerusalem would join them. They would join in the celebrations. They picnic together. Today in Sheikh Jarrah, you have a movement of Jews called Ateret Kohanim that are quite literally forcibly expelling Palestinians from their homes. It wasn't just these kinds of shared outings, shared celebrations. Jews, they would have Muslim physicians. A Jew, they would go to Muslim bathhouses. They lived in the same streets in places like Al-Wad in the old city of Jerusalem. You have one anecdote in the literature, I believe from Ya'qub Yehoshua, who was a Jew in late Ottoman Jerusalem. He talks about how you had these courtyards in the old city of Jerusalem in which you had 5 or 6, 7 families living in one share, and they would share a courtyard. And the Jewish and Muslim children from one courtyard would gang up against the Jewish and Muslim children from another courtyard. The fault lines in late Ottoman Jerusalem were not even between and amongst the communities, they were actually within them. And the final point, I'm sorry, I said the last point was final, but the final point I will make here is that they also shared a common political vision for Palestine. It was called Ottomanism, and it was embraced by the Committee for Union and Progress, the CUP, aka the Young Turks, a very important political party that carried out a constitutional revolution in 1908 that called for a secular constitution, that called for equality between Jews, Muslims, and Christians, that called for freedom of the press, that called for elections, democratic elections. And you actually had Jews, Muslims, and Christians all running for CUP roles. They were all in the same political party, all advocating for the same set of civic values.
When did Zionist immigration first begin? I guess in the 19th century, and under what circumstances? What was driving it?
The Russian Empire was probably the worst place in the world to be Jewish in the 1880s. You had pogroms all the time. The Tsar of Russia was assassinated in 1882, and it was blamed on the Jews of the Russian Empire. And you had this wave of pogroms, these anti-Jewish riots, violence, in which hundreds, perhaps thousands of Jews were killed in the early 1880s. And of course, that wasn't the first time Jews had faced violence in Europe. They had a long history of experiencing anti-Jewish violence, anti-Semitism. They were ghettoized, so they weren't allowed to participate in European culture. They weren't allowed to join most professions, right? They were secluded, both in terms of where they could live, but also what professions they could become. And so you had this thing that was known as the Jewish question. What's the solution to the quote-unquote Jewish question or the Jewish problem? That is to say that there's the problem that there are Jews in Europe. At least that was the perspective of many of the anti-Semites. And that's why it was called the Jewish problem. And so all of these Jews came up with all these different solutions to the Jewish problem. We're going to assimilate. We're going to try to become British, become French, become German, just like any other British, French, and German. And many tried that. And that was the dominant perspective. There was another perspective that said, no, we need to hunker down. We need to become more Orthodox. We need to become more traditional. We need to, now that they're opening the door to us, we need to reject it even more. And that was kind of the ultra-Orthodox tendency in Judaism. You had obviously socialists and communists. I mean, in Russia, in the Russian Empire, and even in Poland and much of Lithuania, the Baltic states, Hungary, in these places, the dominant trend was not assimilation, and nor was it ultra-Orthodox Judaism. It was communism and socialism. And the Bund, you're probably somewhat familiar with these Jewish socialists that were known as the Bund. They were by far the most popular party, both in Russia, among Jews of Russia, who also, I mean, actually, communism may have been more popular in the Russian Empire than the Bund. But then in Poland, after World War I, the dominant political force among Jews in interwar Poland was the Bund, and they were socialists. They were also anti-Zionist. So you had all these different responses to the Jewish question or the emancipation of the Jews, and Zionism was one of those responses. The final point I will make here is that Zionism was also a form of Jewish nationalism, right? It was this idea that you have all these nationalist movements around Europe, all these groups claiming their nations, and they have a right to national self-determination. And the Jews said, well, okay, we're not allowed to be part of the Russian nation or the German nation or the French nation. So then, okay, so we're our own nation. The Jews are our own nation. And so there was this movement to try and transform Judaism from a religion to a nation.
Thank you so much. That is so helpful. So let's move maybe ahead a little bit to a very consequential year, 1948. What precipitated the 1948 war? There's this widespread myth that the war is somewhat of a David Goliath 2.0, right? That little old Israel versus the overwhelming number of Arabs. What really happened? Who threw the first punch?
Yeah, so first of all, let me just say that the consensus among all serious historians of the 1948 war, this would include Benny Morris, this would include Ilan Pappé, this would include Yoav Gelbar, who's genocidal Zionist historian. This would include Shai Haskani, and obviously all Palestinian historians, who I didn't mention, people like Nur Masalha and Walid Khalidi. But basically, there's no debate among historians here.
Okay.
The Zionists had a distinctive military advantage over both the native Palestinian Arabs as well as the Arab armies in Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. But let me back up a little bit. What led to the 1948 war? So, I mean, there were, I think, 2 or 3 proximate causes. I think the most important one was, of course, that for 30 years, from 1918 to 1948, the British rejected the political will of the overwhelming majority of the people of Palestine. The British Mandate for Palestine, one of these post-World War I mandatory states like Jordan, like Iraq, and others, it was anti-democratic. The Americans sent a commission in 1918 to survey the will of the people of Palestine. It was called the King-Crane Commission. And 85% of Palestinians told that American King-Crane Commission they rejected a Zionist program in Palestine. 85% of people rarely agree on anything, but there was more consensus on that than basically anything else. The only thing Palestinian Arabs could agree on in 1918 was that we don't want our country taken over by a foreign group of settlers whose mission is to create a state for them in our country. So that is the underlying cause of the war in 1948. It was 30 years of colonial violence. 30 years in which the British told the Palestinian Arabs, who petitioned them year after year, we want a state. We want to create a democratic state. We want elections. We want democratic institutions. So that the Palestinians are petitioning them every year, 1921, 1922, every year. Please, just let us hold elections, because democracy is on the side of the Palestinians. Democracy is not on the side of the Zionists in 1918 or in 1923 or in 1934 or in 1947, because they're a minority. So the Palestinians are screaming, democracy, democracy, democracy. The British are saying, no, no, no. And so after about 13 years of that, from 22 until 1935, 1936, you get small-scale violence until 1936, when the Palestinians are fed up. And you get this, one of the largest anti-colonial revolts in history, which the British violently suppress. And that revolt lasts for about 3 years, and the Palestinians are brutally suppressed. And after that revolt, the revolt doesn't fundamentally change anything. The British continue to encourage and facilitate Zionist land purchases and Zionist immigration to Palestine against the political will of the vast majority of the population. And by 1947, the British say, we've had enough. We're going to turn over the situation to the UN. And the UN says, we're going to partition Palestine. Well, guess what? The problem with the partition plan was the same problem with the British Mandate. No one bothered to ask what the Palestinians themselves thought. Did the Palestinians want to partition their own country? Forget about the Palestinians. Did the people living in Palestine, did they survey the people living in Palestine, ask what they wanted? No, they didn't. They just made a decision. They said, we're going to partition Palestine. And here's how the partition plan was going to work. Palestine was going to be divided into an Arab state and a Jewish state. The Jewish state would be about 55% of Palestine, even though the Jews were about 33% of the population of the country, and even though they only owned about 7% of the land of Palestine. And the only reason they were 33% of the population and 7% of the and owned 7% of the land was because of 30 years of anti-democratic violence. But let's leave that aside. The Arab state would have been 45% of the country, even though the Arabs were 2/3 of the population and owned the vast majority of the land. Now, here's the real kicker. The Jewish state would have been about 55% Jews, 45% Palestinians. That, I thought it was partition where you're dividing the country, but so it's like the Jewish state was like half. Whereas the Palestinian state was like it was going to be about 99% Palestinian and 1% Jewish. Now, let me ask you this. If you're one of those 45% of the Palestinians who was going to wind up inside the Jewish state, we're talking hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. By the way, almost all of whom were expelled, right? The vast majority of the Palestinians that found themselves within the territory that was proposed to be a Jewish state by the UN, almost all of them were expelled, right? And so this plan, you're basically telling hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Palestine, guess what? You're going to be under the rule of this settler foreign community, of this Jewish community, whose purpose is to create a Jewish state to guarantee Jewish security and Jewish prosperity and Jewish development and Jewish expansion, but you're Palestinian. So the Palestinians rejected that plan. And you got basically an outbreak of civil war immediately after the plan was announced. You get this kind of internecine violence between the Jewish community of Palestine and the Palestinian Arab community in Palestine that lasted from about November 1947. That really lasted until May 1948. And during that period, so we're talking about, what is that, roughly 6 months or so, the Zionist community expelled by force. So this is before a single Arab army has invaded Palestine, right? This is part of the quote unquote civil war between the native Palestinians and the foreign settler community. The Zionist community, beginning in March and April 1948, adopts Plan Dalet, which is a blueprint for ethnic cleansing. And they go village to village in late March, April, and May, and expel hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, about maybe 300,000 Palestinians in those 2 months. And sort of that is, and then Israel declares itself a state in May 1948. And then after Israel's a state, after it's been recognized by the Soviet Union and the United States, it then goes on a campaign in the north called Operation Hiram, in which it expels about 200,000 more Palestinians from the Galilee, where the goal of the operation is to expel Palestinians, right? Israel's already a state, right? The war, Israel has already established itself as a state, but it goes on another operation in the north, and then it goes on another operation in the south, expelling maybe another 100,000 Palestinians from the south, from places like Bersaba, from Majda al-Shams, from what is known as the Gaza envelope, all these towns that surrounded Gaza, including Juba, which is where Sheikh Ahmed Yassin is from, who was the founder of Hamas, who was expelled from his home when he was 13 years old in 1948. So Israel then expels another 100,000 in the south. So by the end of the war, Israel has conquered about 78% of historical Palestine. It has expelled about 750,000 Palestinians from their homes. It has destroyed between 400 and 500 Palestinian villages. And then after the war, obviously it had to make sure none of those Palestinians came home. Right? I mean, that's why it's expulsion, because obviously some of them left on their own. Some of them were expelled by force. Some of them were worried that they were going to be massacred or raped. There were about a dozen cases of individual incidents of rape in which dozens of Palestinian women were raped in the war. So there are all these rumors of massacres and rapes and violence, and so Palestinians flee. But what makes it ethnic cleansing is that after the war, none of them were allowed to return home, right? Because they had the wrong religion. Obviously, Jewish refugees were allowed to return home, but Palestinian refugees weren't.
Interesting. So interesting. Zach, another myth that we often hear is that, well, Palestinians didn't really have an identity. They were just living there, that it was only invented in the wake of Zionism, in the wake of the 20th century. What was Palestinians' connection to land, identity, and culture like in the Ottoman era, pre-Zionism?
Yeah, so the word Palestine, Philistine in Arabic, dates to the early Islamic period. The Muslim conquerors inherited the word Palestina, which was used by the Byzantine rulers who had ruled Palestine before the Muslim conquest, and they embraced that word. It becomes Philistine in Arabic, and for about a couple hundred years, you have a district in the Umayyad Caliphate known as Jund Philistine, the district of Palestine, and whose capital was actually Ramleh. You might say Ramleh was like the most important city in the world for about a decade or two. I know a city most people have never heard of, but I mean, this was the most powerful empire in the world, and its capital was in Palestine, in Ramleh. So anyways, it's a district for a few hundred years. The Crusaders invade Palestine at the end of the 11th century, and they do not, do not use the word Palestine in their own administrative parlance. Neither do the Ayyubid conquerors, Salahuddin, or the Mamluks or the Ottomans. So the word Palestine falls from administrative use. But this is really the subject of my dissertation research, so we could talk about this for hours if you guys wanted to. But the word continues to be used in at least two contexts. So the word Palestine is remembered more or less continuously without any interruptions for the past 1,300 years in the Arab Middle East. It's remembered by people from the city of Ramla who continually call the place Palestine for centuries and centuries. And Palestine is remembered this for the same reason that Mesopotamia and Phoenicia are remembered, right? Like, we don't call Lebanon Phoenicia. We don't call Iraq Mesopotamia. But most people who are educated and, have read a bit about history, have heard of those words, because that's the way those places used to be called. And that's the same with Palestine, I think, in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, is that an educated Muslim or Christian would have heard of the word Palestine because that's how the place used to be called. And then what happened was, in the mid to late 19th century, you get all these Europeans and Americans and Russians that are moving to Palestine, and they're calling the place Palestine. Right. That's a whole nother story of why they're calling the place Palestine. I think more so than people in Palestine are. But basically, you get this linguistic transmutation. And once again, it's so seamless because the people already knew that word. They were already calling the place Palestine, but it gets revitalized and it gets repopularized. And thus, beginning in, say, 1850s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, more and more people in Palestine start calling the place Palestine. They start to publish books on Palestine. They start to publish newspapers using, like, with the name Palestine in the title of the newspaper. And then they start calling themselves Palestinians. The first reference to, like, a modern Palestinian person in literature in sort of the late 19th century, at least the first reference I've been able to find, you have this British consul in Jerusalem. His name is James Finn, and he publishes a memoir in 1870. So this is, like we said, about 8 years before a single Zionist settler has moved to Palestine. He describes the Arabic-speaking peoples of Palestine as Palestinians in that book.
This is such an important question, important topic of discussion. Have you published your dissertation? Because this is something that I think people ought to be reading about.
I have not published my dissertation. Thank you for those encouraging words. I would like to publish it at some point. Yeah, but I agree it's an important topic. That's why I chose to write 300 words on it.
Yeah. You know what? If there's
300 pages. Sorry.
Yeah, I was like, whoa.
You know what? Listen, if there's opportunity to publish it, go for it, because I think that's a book that people should buy for sure. Let me bring us back to, like, right around 1948. As we know today, Palestinian territory is divided up between the West Bank and Gaza, and they are not connected by land. Israel proper is right kind of in the middle. How did Gaza after 1948 come under Egyptian administration and the West Bank under Jordanian control? How did that come about?
Love that question, because it really kind of gets to the core of sort of the history of Zionist settlement in Palestine. So you have to ask yourself, like, why did Gaza become almost a warehouse for Palestinian refugees, as did the West Bank, and then why were they taken over by Egypt and Jordan? Yeah. Recall that the Zionist settlers were able to settle in areas from 1880 and 1948 in places where they were able to buy land. That's very, very, very important. Because, like we said, they bought about 7% of the land of Palestine from 1880 to 1948. And if you look at maps of where those settlements were, you're going to find that they were in basically the coastal plains. So kind of north, the coastal plains north of what is today the Gaza Strip, right? Going all the way up to Haifa, and then also the Galilee, especially the eastern Galilee, the Baisan. These were the kind of the Zionist strongholds. Why? That's where they were able to buy land. Why were they able to buy land there? Because historically, that land was undesirable. Because it was either lowland. So in the lowlands, like the coastal plains, historically, over the course of many, many centuries, Palestinians and Arabs didn't want to live there because they constantly faced Bedouin attacks. You were much more secure either in the mountainous interior, right? That's why all the big population centers, big Palestinian population centers, for the most part, not all of them, but they're either, you have the obviously port cities, but then the big population centers are all in the mountainous interior. Jerusalem, Hebron, Nablus, Jenin, Beit Lehem, Tulkarm. I mean, those are 5 of the biggest Palestinian cities historically. And they were all in the mountainous interior because you have more protection from Bedouin raids. So historically, that's why Palestinians were concentrated in the mountainous interior rather than the coastal plains. And so in the second half of the 19th century, when the Ottoman Empire privatized land, the land that basically fell into the hands of private owners was land Palestinians didn't really want. They kind of sold it off to these private landowners in Beirut and Haifa and Damascus and so that was this kind of undesirable land in the coastal plains, and also the Jezreel Valley, which was very swampy, and thus it was a breeding ground for malaria. So this was the only land in Palestine that Zionists were able to buy. So the Zionist strongholds were the coastal plains, the Galilee, the Jezreel Valley, and the Beisan, which was kind of on the border with Jordan. Now, so that those were the areas where the Zionists were able to create a strong foothold. And so during the 1948 war, what they did was they sought to basically create territorial depth around their nucleus of settlements. And of course, the main area they wanted to do that was in the central area of the country, right? So Jerusalem, all these villages to the west of Jerusalem, places like Deir Yassin, in which there was a massacre, in which the Zionist forces killed hundreds of Palestinians, execution style. Of course, also Ramle and Lid, they depopulated in July 1940. 40,000 Palestinians were sent effectively on a death march from Ramle and Lid to the east. So basically what happened was during the war, so the Zionists are trying to control the interior of the country, and then they're trying to control all that area kind of from the interior moving up to the north, and then they're trying to control the south. So what do? They're pushing Palestinians, right, into Gaza. So all those Palestinians that were in Majd al-Shams and in the Gaza envelope, in all those towns, Saf, they were pushing. So they pushed Palestinians into Gaza, and then same was true in the central part of the country, right? Like I said, Ramla and Lid, they pushed those Palestinians into the West Bank, into Ramallah, and then in the north they pushed them into Lebanon or Syria. So that is kind of how the Zionist. That is why the West Bank was never taken over by the Zionist community, because there are no Zionist settlements in the West Bank. There were almost none before 48. The thinking in 1948 was, we want to control as much of the country as possible with as few Arabs in the country as possible. So you want the land without the people. So Ben-Gurion was very careful not to occupy the West Bank because it was 99% Palestinian. Instead, what he did was he made an alliance with King Abdullah of Jordan, because Jordan wanted to occupy the West Bank, because you have holy sites there. Who doesn't want to occupy more land? He thought that this would bring him more prestige. He wanted to control Jerusalem. Therefore, he's kind of sitting on top of the third holiest site in Islam, right? How much prestige would that bring him, right? So Jordan wants to occupy.
Jordan was a relatively new political entity.
Correct. Jordan was established as part of this post-World War I kind of colonial system known as the Mandate System. And it was established by the British, and they put Amir Faisal's brother, what was his name? They put one of these Hijazi notables in charge of the country, but it was a British mandate, just like Palestine was a British mandate. And this Jordanian, but by the way, remember that the Jordanian army was basically a British army. It was run by a British officer named Gulub Pasha. But anyways, the Zionists made an alliance with Gulub Pasha to kind of knock them out, to neutralize them, right? So because they don't want to fight this, basically this Arab Legion run by a British officer that is well armed and well trained, and like they were the most capable fighting force in the war, and they were neutralized by the Zionists, who made an agreement with them on the eve of the war. We won't attack you. You don't attack us. We'll let you take the West Bank. You don't attack the Zionist enterprise. So they make that alliance, neutralizing the fiercest of all the Arab fighting forces. And then as for the case with Gaza, you may be surprised to learn that in December 1948, the Israeli army, and I'm calling it the Israeli army now because we're 6 months into the state of Israel's establishment, they go on an offensive, like I said, in the south, and they tried to take over both Gaza and Sinai, and they were very close to taking them. And in December 1948, then U.S. President, was it Eisenhower? I'm forgetting now who was president in 48. The U.S. president at the time, together with the British prime minister, apply a tremendous amount of pressure on Israel to halt that offensive. But otherwise, Israel would have conquered Gaza and probably expelled all the Palestinians into Sinai. That was the plan. And the reason why the U.S. and the British government applied so much pressure on Israel to get out of Gaza and halt that offensive in 48 was, you're not going to believe this. At the time, the belief was that Israel was this state that was probably going to align with the socialist bloc rather than the the capitalist bloc, right? It was going to align with the East rather than the West. Or there was fear that they would, because Israel, right? They had all these kibbutzim, these sort of socialist communities in which, and so they were actually worried. And Israel obviously was, Zionism came before socialism, but it had socialist tendencies, right? It was a kind of a socialist movement. And so they were worried that they would join the Soviet Union. And the last thing the British wanted was Soviet influence on the eastern flank of the Suez Canal, the most important possession of the British Empire, right? Linking the motherland to the crown jewel of the empire. And remember, the British government controlled the Suez Canal until 1954, when the Free Officers' Revolution led by Gamal Abdel Nasser took over, nationalized the Suez Canal in 54. Which is, by the way, why Israel, Britain, and France then invaded Egypt in 56, the tripartite aggression, the Suez Crisis, to take back the canal, right? But that was the reason why Israel did not conquer Gaza in 48. It was because of British and U.S. pressure, owing to those fears that there would be Soviet influence on the eastern flank of the Suez Canal.
That is helpful information. Yeah, I just learned something. Thank you.
It's not well known. That history is not well known at all.
Yeah. No, that was super helpful. Okay, I got to read more on that. That's good.
I think it's so helpful. History really does inform the choices that we make today, and to be able to connect the dots along the way really does transform the choices that we make today. So thank you, Doc. Moving on a little then to kind of keep in our timeline, let's talk about 1967. When Israel began occupying Gaza, the Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. What precipitated the Six-Day War?
So the first thing to say here is that in the aftermath of the 1948 war, as we said, Israeli leaders lamented their failure to take over all of Palestine in 48. Now, some of them, like Ben-Gurion, were worried about taking over territory that had too many Arabs in it. But many, many other Zionist leaders didn't really care about that, and they wanted all of Palestine. Yigal Allon says, I can't believe that Ben-Gurion didn't let us, quote unquote, finish the job in 48. By the way, Israeli historians today say similar things, like Benny Morris, who says the problem with the ethnic cleansing in 1948 was that we didn't finish the job. And that's why we've had so many problems over the past 78 years. But anyways, the belief in Israel was that we have such a weak, unviable state. I mean, to quote Abba Eban, Israel's perhaps most famous UN ambassador, he said, the Israel's borders from 1948 to 1967 were the Auschwitz borders. In other words, if you believed that Israel should have remained within its 48 borders, that was tantamount to supporting another Holocaust of the Jews. That was the attitude by Israel's leaders from 48 to 67. And by the way, from 48 to 67, Israel did everything in its power to violate the armistice lines. They literally took over the entire DMZ zone, this demilitarized zone between Israel and Syria, obsessed with encroaching on Syrian territory. They wanted the Golan Heights, obviously, right? They wanted that mountainous territory that overlooked much of the northern part of the country. They obviously also wanted Gaza. And in 1948-49, they annexed about a 3-kilometer strip of Gaza. This is also not appreciated. But Salman Abu Sitta has done the dirty work and basically uncovered the fact that Israel stole about 3 kilometers of Gaza after the armistice agreement with Egypt was signed in 1949. And by the way, they were doing the same thing with Jordan, acre by acre, dunham by dunham, trying to take over what was in the Latrun, which was another kind of demilitarized zone and was another area Israel wanted to control over that they didn't control over in 40. So the point I'm trying to make here is that Israel's doing everything in its power to push its control and its domination up to and beyond the armistice lines of 48 because it was unhappy and deeply unsatisfied with those 1948 borders. By the way, that's why Israel never declared its borders. They insisted that the armistice lines were just that. They were armistice lines. They weren't borders, and they should not prejudge the whatever final borders end up becoming. But of course, Israel has never declared its borders to the present day. All of that is background to say that in the months and years actually leading up to June 1967, all of those border skirmishes were escalating. The Syrian Israeli border skirmishes are escalating, as are skirmishes with Egypt. And basically the immediate trigger is that the Soviet Union tells Egypt that there's an Israeli threat on Syria. And of course, there had been many, many dozens, hundreds of threats over the years. And so the Egyptians believed that. And as a response, they move troops into the Sinai Peninsula. They kick out this UN peacekeeping force, and they close the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. That's the port of Eilat in the southern part of the country. Now, American and Israeli intelligence assessments were that first of all, Nasser doesn't want a war. Second, that even if he did attack, and even if the other Arab states joined, Israel was by far the military superpower here and would destroy the Arab armies, even if attacked first, right? That was the consensus of both Israeli and American intelligence assessments. But for Israel, this wasn't a crisis. This was an opportunity. As we just said, Israel had spent the previous 18 years doing everything in its power to extend a border, just another dunam, just another kilometer. And so it finally had the cause bell. It finally had this excuse, right? This wasn't a crisis. This was an opportunity. So on June 5th, 1967, in a surprise attack, Israel destroys the Egyptian Air Force. On June 6th, it invades the West Bank. It takes over in 6 days the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula, tripling the size of the country in 6 days. Right. And in the aftermath of the war, in the early 1970s, every single Israeli leader that made the decision to go to war in June 1967, all of them, there were no exceptions, they came out in 1970, 1971, and 1972 confessing that that after the war they had invented this narrative, this myth that Israel had faced an existential threat, and had they not acted first, they would have been wiped out. That was a myth, that was a lie perpetrated after the war in order to justify what was at the time a war of choice and a war of aggression. And there were 0 people in the cabinet, in the Israeli security cabinet, that made the decision to go to war that would disagree with what I just said.
That's such a bold statement, and I'm sure, like, for many people, a deep surprise. Sorry, Jeff, you were about to say something.
No. I'm just soaking up what you're saying, Zach. So much information to process. Yeah, it's very, very, very helpful.
It's, of all Israel's insidious lies that it spreads, this is, I think, one of the ones that has stuck the most, especially with the general public. This idea that Israel was facing annihilation in 1967. Yeah. Israel was not facing annihilation. They literally in 6 days annihilated the combined armies of all of its neighbors. Israel was like the military superpower. It was a David and Goliath, where Israel was the Goliath and its neighbors were the David. I mean, Israel was by far the military power in that war. There was no military historians debate that.
So, like, this idea that, like, Israel can break international law because it was its very existence was at threat, that kind of validates the so many laws that are broken and kind of people's perception on, okay, it's okay because they're about to be extinct. Can you tell us how Israel is in violation of international law? Like, is it? First question. And if so, how? Since 1948 and then 1967?
Well, international law has many pieces to it, right? You have customary law, you have treaties. Mm-hmm. Maybe we can start with UN resolutions. The UN is perhaps lies at the center of international law, at least today. And the UN Security Council, when it passes a resolution, that's a binding resolution. And they've passed dozens and dozens and dozens of resolutions calling on Israel to allow the Palestinians that expelled in 1948 to return to their homes, calling on Israel to withdraw from territories that occupied in 1967, calling the occupation illegal. It did that in 2005 when it called the wall that Israel built in occupied territory illegal because the occupation itself was illegal. It reaffirmed that decision in 2024, declaring that the occupation is illegal. This is a July 2024 ICJ ruling. Israel's presence, every single Israeli soldier stationed in the occupied territories of Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank, every single Israeli tank there, every single Israeli plane that flies over those territories, every single Israeli attempt to blockade those territories from the sea by the Jordan River, those are all illegal. So That's undebated. Now, what happened in a very awkward moment in international legal history, was that this kind of Frankenstein decision, this decision that was passed, calling for the establishment of the Board of Peace. Right, this is going back to last the 2025. Kind of erased all of that history. It's quite remarkable that so we have this new UN resolution now but I would say that UN resolution was itself a violation of international law. So even though it was passed by the Security Council, so but leaving aside that hiccup, Israel is they're violating the Rome Statute because Israel is operating an apartheid regime. Apartheid is an international legal crime defined by the Rome Statute of 1999. So they're in violation of that as well. Why is Israel an apartheid state? Because it operates two legal systems. It operates one legal system that is for its citizens, and then it operates a second legal system. These are for Palestinians that live under Israeli control but do not have rights in the state of Israel. They can't vote. They don't have freedom of movement. They don't get an Israeli passport. They don't have property rights. Their property, they don't have. They also, like, they can be arrested and abducted and imprisoned and tortured and raped without any recourse, because they don't have the right to a jury. They don't have a right to a lawyer. They don't have a right to a free and fair trial, right? So they have no rights. So that's the 3.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and the 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza who don't even have the right to life. They, the right to water or the right to food. They're being starved to death. They're being denied shelter. They're being blockaded, right? So that's the case with about 5 million Palestinians living under Israeli rule. And that's why Israel's an apartheid state, because it has two different, actually it's probably more like 3 or 4 different legal systems, but it has different like laws and courts for different categories of human beings based on their racial, religious, ethnic identity. So we're talking military occupation, we're talking denial of the right to return, we're talking apartheid, and then obviously over the past 2.5 years now we can add genocide to that list of crimes. I think every human rights organization, at least every credible one in the world, has characterized Israel's actions in Gaza as genocidal, and we won't know the outcome of the ICJ genocide case probably for a few more years. But we don't need to know the outcome, because the Convention on the Crime and Prevention of Genocide of 1948 requires that states act to prevent a genocide from happening.
Yeah. So like, you have to act to prevent. And obviously, even if you want to argue that Israel maybe hasn't yet committed a genocide in Gaza, there's certainly a risk of that happening. I mean, I think we're 2.5 years in. If you don't believe there's a risk of genocide happening, you're not a serious person. Right.
So now they're also in violation of the 1948 Convention on the Crime and Prevention of Genocide. The list goes on and on.
Would you, just for the sake of accuracy here, would you say that Israel is in violation of international law in the way that you've laid out since 1967, or would you trace it all the way back to 1948 since its inception?
It's a great question, and by the way, I think this is probably the thing that divides kind of liberal Jews, anti-Zionist Jews more than anything else. I think Palestinians don't really aren't quite as hung up over 48 versus 67 as Jews are, including anti-Zionist Jews. But it's a very good question, because it kind of gets at this question of when Israel was established in 48. Like, how? First of all, we know it established 750. It expelled 750,000 Palestinians from their homes, and it wouldn't have been established as a Jewish state if it hadn't done that. So that does cast some moral doubts over the founding of the country, especially when in the years after the wars we said all these refugees. It's not that they were like, oh, they found better lives in Europe and the U.S. No, they were impoverished, they were landless, they were stateless, and they wanted to go home. And by the way, tens of thousands of them tried to go home. And between 1949 and 1956, Israel shot and killed between 2,700 and 5,000 of them, crossing those armistice lines from Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, and Syria, trying to return to their homes, to reclaim property, see family, etc. They were shot and killed. So, no, it was a very violent founding, established on the dispossession of nearly a million Palestinians. And so, certainly, I think from a moral lens, Israel was born in sin. From a legal lens, perhaps less so, because it was recognized by the United States, the Soviet Union, the UN. It immediately was recognized and immediately got international recognition. And so in order to be a state in the international system, the only requirement really is that other states recognize you're a state. That's how to become a state. You get recognized by other states. Somaliland isn't a state because it's not recognized by other states. As soon as Somaliland gets recognized by other states, it becomes a state. That's really the only requirement of statehood, is that other states agree you're a state. And so from a legal perspective, in the Westphalian international system that emerged over the past few hundred years, Israel became a state after 1948. Now, I think where Israel really got in trouble, like you said, was in 1967, right? Because there's no debate about the military occupation after 67, right? Legal scholars don't debate it. Like we said, UN resolutions don't really debate it. The international legal community doesn't debate it. It was illegal, and Israel needed to withdraw from those territories. The debate, there's no longer a debate. We can debate 48, we can't debate 67.
Yeah. No, that's very helpful, because we certainly don't want to play fast and loose with charges of violations of international law, and it's, as you say, it's very clear that from 1967 forward, this is flagrant. You can have a debate about 1948. But certainly since 1967, I don't think there's any debate to be had whatsoever. We are an hour in. we're having a rip-roaring good time here. A few more questions, if you don't mind.
Sure thing.
Yeah. Now, so you've laid out 1967 and the fallout of 1967, and then, of course, in 1973, there was something called the Yom Kippur War, which my understanding is basically ended in kind of a stalemate. And then in 1979, Israel reaches normalized relations with Egypt, and it kind of removing itself from Sinai. And then in 1988, Jordan kind of relinquishes its claim over the West Bank, which, of course, Israel had occupied since 1967 and continues to occupy. All of that kind of brings us up into the early 90s with Oslo. And I think almost everyone listening to this and watching this has seen that iconic image, of the handshake between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin with Slick Willie Bill Clinton in the middle.
One sec.
Yeah, you got it there? Yeah, that's what. There it is, right there.
That one, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. With Slick Willie in the middle, kind of presenting himself as a broker of peace. What? I guess this is a big question, but if you can kind of summarize it as best you can, what exactly were the Oslo Accords? It happened over a period, I guess, from 92 to 95. How did that come about? And I guess the more important thing is, what did the Oslo Accords achieve, and how have they failed?
Yeah, we could also talk about the Oslo Accords for hours, because there's so much to say. But just to sort of set up the Oslo Accords, right? You have the PLO, which is the Palestinian Liberation Organization, this Palestinian organization based in exile, founded in 1959. No, founded in 1963 or 4 in Egypt. And it over the course of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they carry out lots of attacks on Israeli targets, right? They become this infamous organization, obviously described as a terrorist organization by the West, described as a liberation organization by the Palestinians, and they subsume all these Palestinian groups. It becomes a kind of the Palestinian government in exile, if you will, right? It's and so that they're negotiating with Israel in this process, and they signed this agreement in 1993, in which Israel agrees to basically subcontract out urban areas of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to the PLO, which then establishes the PA, the Palestinian Authority, a kind of a subsidiary to the PLO. And that's the gist of the agreement. So let me just repeat that. It's not well appreciable what the actual agreement was over the course of a few years, and it lasted from 93 till, let's say, 99, 2000 is when it really just broke down, and it's not really even fair to talk about an Oslo process after that. But basically, over the course of this 7-year period, the agreement was that Israel will agree to subcontract out civilian and even security affairs in urban areas of Gaza and the West Bank to the Palestinian Authority. What that means is, beginning in 1993, instead of Israeli soldiers patrolling the streets of Hebron and Khan Yunis and Nablus, Palestinian Authority security officials are patrolling the streets of Nablus, Khan Yunis, and Hebron. You may be asking, like, well, I thought this was this was a peace deal where Israel's going to end the occupation and the Palestinians are going to get a state. That's not what it was. It was so for Israel had spent the past 6 years facing off with Palestinian children throwing stones at tanks. It was called the First Intifada, the first uprising from 87 to 93, in which you get and then that's what drove Israel into negotiations in the first place. You have this massive uprising. Israel it couldn't just hold on to these territories forever and deny millions of Palestinians basic rights forever. It needed to come up with some kind of solution to the problem that was Israel's occupation. And so Oslo was the solution, right? It was occupation maintenance. Because like I said, from 87 to 93, you had about 180 Israelis, mostly soldiers, were killed by Palestinians. It was a mostly nonviolent, mostly unarmed uprising. But of course, there were some Israelis that were killed. By 180 Israelis killed, about 1,100 Palestinians killed. The overwhelming majority of the Israelis killed during that uprising were soldiers. The overwhelming majority of the Palestinians killed were civilians, and many of them were children. And so after that uprising, Israel realized it just doesn't want to be bogged down in the territories, just being faced with resistance and protests and demonstrations, and so eventually it wanted to extricate itself from the territories while still controlling them. And that's what Oslo was. So it subcontracts out urban control. So now you have Palestinians, they're in charge of their own Ministry of Education, which has to obviously report to the Israeli Ministry of Education. Palestinians now have their own health. They can now control their own health ministries. They can clean the streets. They can issue building permits in urban areas of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In the rural areas, this is areas. So area A would be the urban areas. Areas B and C are semi-rural and rural, where Israel had total security control. Yep. So Israel maintained control over 80%. That is the 80% of the West Bank that they wanted. That is the Jordan Valley. That's all the sparsely populated areas. Remember, you want the land without the people living on it. And so Israel continued to maintain control over those areas. It continued to expand the settlements. Right between 1993 and 2000, Israel tripled the settler population, or doubled the settler population. So at a time when Israel is supposed to be making concessions to the Palestinians, giving land back, quote unquote, to the Palestinians, it was actually doing the opposite. It was taking over more land from Palestinians and actually making life in the occupied Palestinian territories much, much worse. And this is the key point here. During the Oslo process, life got much worse for Palestinians. 1993 to 2000, way more violent for Palestinians than 87 to 93. Lots of Palestinians were killed during that period. Hugely violent. And on top of the violence, Israeli authorities they locked down Gaza and the West Bank for long stretches of time. So in 1996, 97, this is called the Israeli policy known as closure, where the Israeli military locks down the entirety of the Gaza and the West Bank. No one can leave their towns, villages, and refugee camps. And for a period of about 100 days in 1996 and 97, and of course doing this to prevent terrorist attacks, right? It's always in the name of security. But of course they led to an unemployment crisis in the Gaza Strip in 97, where 75% of Palestinians became unemployment in 97. Well, of course they're unemployed. They can't leave their towns to go to work. And so you have a massive the World Food Program actually spun up an emergency food operation in 1997. This is 10 years before Israel imposed a blockade on Gaza. Because you have tens of thousands of Palestinians going hungry in 1997 at a time during the quote-unquote peace process. So the Oslo process, I mean, if I had to sort of describe at a more abstract level the nature of the problem of the Oslo and why it failed, I think that was your last question.
Yeah.
Here's why Oslo failed. Israel was both a party to the agreement, but Israel was also the enforcer of the agreement. Just to give a very concrete example of what I mean, in the late 90s, there was this video that was the video was actually leaked in 2001, but it's a video of Benjamin Netanyahu. It's a TRT video. You can find this video online where he's sitting. He thinks he's speaking in private, right? He doesn't realize someone's recording him, and he says, "I in the 1999 Y memorandum." In 1998, because Netanyahu was prime minister in 97, 98, right? And his goal is to just sabotage the Oslo process. And the way he does this is he says, look, he tells the Americans and he tells the Palestinians, he says, I will not continue the process. I'm basically going to pull out of Oslo. So again, he can what is Palestinians going to do if he pulls out? Nothing, because they're the only sovereign between the river and the sea. So he threatens. He says, I get to define what a military, because the word military facility, the word facility appears in the Accords that says Israel gets to maintain its military facilities. I forget where, I think in the Jordan Valley, right? He says during the process. So Netanyahu says, he tells the Americans and he tells the Palestinians, I and I alone get to define what a military facility is. And if you don't like that, then I'm out. Then we're done with Oslo. So he defines a military facility as the entirety of the Jordan Valley. So 60% of the West Bank is a military facility. So if you get to define the words of the terms of the agreement as you like, well, again, you're starting to see what the Oslo process was. It was a ruse. It was a way for Israel to present itself as making painful concessions for peace. Right. Well, at the same time, expanding its control, intensifying its control, entrenching its control and its domination and its occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. That's what Oslo was.
Oh, thank you. This has been such an informative historical overview, and you've been so generous with your time. But we can't end this conversation without kind of discussing Hamas. And I think this is our second last big question. This political entity behind the flood of October 7th, right? So a little history before we get to the question. So it's often thought that Hamas is hell-bent on alienating or annihilating Israel, eliminating every Jewish person in the land. And it's true that the 1988 charter is a militant document, but the revised charter in 2017 calls for a return to the 1967 borders, which is consistent with the two-state solution that the people talk about. Can you tell us what led to the rise of Hamas? How did it emerge victorious in Gaza in 2006?
Yeah, so Hamas was originally called Al-Mujama' al-Islami, which translates roughly to the Islamic Collective. And it was founded by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who, as we mentioned, was expelled from his home in what became Israel. Juba, I believe, was the name of the village. He was expelled to Gaza in 1948 at the age of 13. And so he grew up as under Egyptian. He grew up under Egyptian occupation and then Israeli occupation. And in 1973, he establishes this Islamic Collective. It's a charity organization. It's kind of an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. He's a preacher. He's pious. It's the whole point of this Islamic Collective is to preach Islam, obviously, establish schools. Women's empowerment was very important to them. They established professional and trade schools for women, after-school programming for kids. They had orphanages. It was a very, I would say, empowering movement. And it grew and it attracted a lot of followers. And then in the 1980s, it was actually funded and supported by Israel itself. And again, this is not debated history. Israeli military officials came out in the 1990s and said they actually attributed their own support and financial support to Hamas, to the Islamic Collective, as the reason why it got so popular. So they according to their own admission, they are the reason why this organization grew throughout the 1980s. And like we said, it was pretty much apolitical, right? That's why Israel supported it, because it, as all colonial powers do, they want to divide and conquer their enemies. And so Israel at the time thought that the PLO, that organization that we talked about before, that signed the Oslo Accords with Israel, that they were the real enemy. And so how do you weaken the PLO? Well, you empower the Islamic Collective, pit the Islamicists against the secularists. And that was Israel's plan. And obviously it backfired, but in the end, Hamas, the Islamic Collective, it's gaining strength and gaining in popularity. And then in December 1987, you get this spontaneous leaderless uprising in which 4 Palestinians are killed in the Gaza Strip by an Israeli truck driver, and this creates this outpouring, these spontaneous protests, and you get these national committees that pop up, and they have sit-ins, and they refuse to pay taxes to the Israeli authorities. Right? It's a real kind of grassroots movement. And Hamas, so the Islamic Collective at the time realizes, remember, like I said, they were apolitical. They stayed out of politics. Like, we can't stay out. Like, this is the most significant challenge to Israeli occupation in 20 years. We got to join. And so in December 1987, they kind of make a decision like, okay, we're going to call ourselves not the Al-Mujamma al-Islami, we're going to call ourselves Hamas. During that first year of the uprising, basically from December 1987 until the end of 1988, the Israeli army enters Gaza and slaughters about 142 Palestinians, and I think they suffer 1 casualty. It's a slaughter. They're just picking off Palestinians every day. And by the way, like I said, they're almost all civilians, and many of them are children. Grotesque violence. And so what happens during that time period? In 1988, you have Hamas leader. This is the third in command in Hamas. He travels from Gaza to Tel Aviv. This is in February 1988. And he meets with then Israeli Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and he says, this violence is unacceptable. Let's talk. Let's make a deal. And he goes back in June 1988, and he presents to then Israeli Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin what is effectively a peace proposal. He says, this is 2 months before the charter comes out. This history is not well known. But Hamas basically says, if you issue a statement declaring your intent to end the occupation, you don't end the occupation. You don't actually have to end it. You just have to declare your intent to end it. You release Palestinian detainees, because remember, Israel's mass arresting Palestinians at this time in 1988. If you release all these Palestinian detainees and you allow us to hold our own elections in the occupied territories so that we can elect our own leaders to negotiate with you, we're open to peace. And of course, and by the way, they say you also have to stop building more settlements. But of course, all these are total non-starters for Israel. They weren't going to stop building settlements. Like we said, from 1982 to 1988, Israel tripled the settler population. They were actively expanding the settler enterprise. Right? They had no intention of ending settlements in Palestine. So it's a complete non-starter. 2 months later, Hamas passes this infamous charter calling for the destruction of Israel, calling their enemy the Jews. And then, but still, it's important to emphasize that Hamas from 1989 till about 1992, they carry out dozens of attacks on Israeli targets, mostly military targets. And by the way, that's why they're not labeled a terrorist organization by the United States until 1996, because they're basically like targeting Israeli soldiers overwhelmingly from 89 until the first attack on a civilian is not until 1990 or 91. And then, of course, what happens? You get Oslo, and they're obviously very hostile to Oslo because, again, it's a capitulation agreement. It's just basically a kind of rebrand of the occupation, and they're trying to sabotage Oslo. But still, it's not until 1994 when Baruch Goldstein, this American Jewish person from Brooklyn, he's from New York. He moves to Israel. He enters the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron on Ramadan, and he slaughters 29 Palestinian worshippers. And this just, And so Hamas basically takes the view at that point that, well, you know, if you're going to kill our children, we're going to kill yours. And they carry out lots of gruesome attacks throughout the late 90s and then obviously into the 2000s in the second Intifada. But by the early to mid 2000s, I would say that Hamas effectively has now increasingly come to embrace what I would call the two-state solution, right? This is, and if you look at the interviews conducted by Hamas leaders in 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, right, in the lead up to their election in January 2006, they're basically plagiarizing UN resolutions. They're saying, we support the establishment of a Palestinian state on the 1967 lines, with a capital in East Jerusalem and a just, a mutually agreeable solution to the Palestinian refugee issue. I mean, they're plagiarizing international law. And that, if you read the Khaled Meshal interview in The Guardian in 2005, and you read the Ismail Haniyeh interview in CNN in 2006, they're all saying that. So they've effectively adopted the two-state solution by, 2004, 5, 6. And by the way, that's been their position for the past 20 years. The only problem is on the other side, you've had the most right-wing governments, each one more right-wing than the previous one, starting from 2009 to the present, with no going back, all of whom believe that there should be only Jewish control from the river to the sea. And they say that explicitly, all of them. Like, there's no Israeli leader left, not Yair Golan, not Yair Lapid, there's no Israeli interested in sharing the land from the river into the sea. They're all, at this point at least, I mean, and again, like I said, basically by the mid-2010s, that was the consensus view in Israel among pretty much all Zionist leaders.
You know, the way you've laid out that history of Hamas and its growing popularity and its evolution, it does explain how Hamas rose to power in 2006 in Gaza. You know, I remember 2006 and hearing news broadcasts as though this is some kind of shock result in the election. And how could this be that Hamas has now been elected? But you know, the way you've laid it out with growing disillusionment among the people, especially with respect to Oslo, it does make sense that Hamas would arise as an alternative. And you know,
I mean,
I think my point is there's a lot of propaganda that we're fed that doesn't really square up against the history.
You're exactly right. The United States was telling everyone, and Israel was telling them, you have to vote for Fatah because Hamas are terrorists. Yeah. Now, the problem was that to Palestinians, Hamas was, they ran charities, they ran orphanages, they ran schools, they cleaned the streets. They were actually believed to be these like relatively uncorrupt, relatively morally upstanding people who were willing to resist Israeli domination and Israeli occupation. Whereas Fatah, run by Mahmoud Abbas, was embroiled in corruption, scandal after corruption scandal. Bad governance, crony capitalism, dealing out all kinds of contracts to your cronies, embezzlement. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars disappearing, according to PA investigations. Like, their own internal investigations discovered that the PA was itself embezzling money. And you're wondering why Hamas won the 2006 elections?
Yeah. You know, maybe this is a good time to draw things to a close. There's so much more we could talk about. We could talk more about Hamas. We could talk more about what keeps you going in your work, your vision of hope. We're gonna have to get you back on the podcast. I think that's for sure. There's just so much more we could address. But you know, I want to thank you for all your time. This has been a wonderful conversation. So much that I've learned, a lot of facts that you've shared that I didn't know about, and just much appreciated.
Thank you guys so much for having me. Always happy to come back.
Now, how can people follow you, follow your work, and perhaps even get in touch with you?
Yeah, so if you want to follow my work, you can find everything I publish on PalestineNexus.com. That's where I have my courses. That's where I publish articles as well. I also now have a Substack, so you can find some stuff on there. But I would say also Twitter is really where I'm most active. So my handle is _Zach Foster. And drop me a DM on Twitter. I will happily reply.
Friends, thank you for joining us on this inaugural episode of Two Priests and Palestine. Jeff and I are looking forward to journeying with you over the next 10 episodes as we hear from Palestinians on the ground in the midst of the work of liberation and justice. Our social media handles on Instagram are Two Priests and Palestine, fully written out, Jeff Nowers, Nowers, and Gerlyn Henry, Gerlyn. We want to thank Scott Drakeford for the music on this podcast and Johan Dampala for producing our promo. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.